Welcome to the debate. Today we're taking a sledgehammer to the foundations of our own house. If you walk into any university library or, browse the nonfiction section of a bookstore, you'll see the history of the world organized into these neat, distinct boxes. You see titles like The History of Western Civilization, The Golden Age of Islamic Civilization, or The Rise of Chinese Civilization. It feels intuitive. It feels like the natural architecture of human life. But within the professional discipline of history, the floorboards are definitely creaking.
Creaking is a very polite way of putting it. I would say the foundation has completely collapsed. The question we're wrestling with today it's fundamental. Is the concept of civilization a valid tool for understanding the past? Or is it a distortion, a kind of funhouse mirror that we built in the modern era and just aimed backward at our ancestors?
I'm going to take what might be the unpopular stance today. I'll argue that we're in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I admit the word civilization carries some very heavy baggage. It has been used as a weapon. But I believe it remains our most necessary macro-analytical tool. We need it to understand the deep structural, the glue that binds human beings together across centuries. Without it, history just dissolves into a chaotic pile of unrelated facts.
And I'm going to argue that the concept is worse than useless. It's actively deceptive. Civilization isn't a natural fact you find out in the wild. It's a normative, modern invention, a political tool, really, that creates these false unities and enforces colonial hierarchies. I believe we're better off abandoning the whole civilizational block model entirely. We should replace it with the study of networks, practices, and circulation.
So, a battle between structure and flow. Let's start with the origins. I think many of our listeners probably assume this word has been with us since the dawn of time, or at least since the pyramids. But that isn't true. However, the idea behind it, that's ancient. Long before the French invented the specific word civilization, complex societies were well aware that they had achieved a specific kind of internal order.
I'm listening, but I am already skeptical.
Well, look at the ancient Greeks. They had the concept of the polis, the city-state, but even more importantly, they had paideia. And this wasn't just education in the sense of, learning math. It was the cultural cultivation of a human being. It was the process of molding a person into a citizen who is capable of liberty. The Romans took this idea and built the concept of civitas, the state of being a citizen, and they linked it to humanitas. They believed that living within this legal and urban structure actually made you more human than the tribes living out in the forests.
It's certainly a convenient belief for an empire to hold.
Perhaps, but look at the Islamic world. The great 14th century thinker Ibn Khaldun developed the science of Umran. This translates roughly to social organization or flourishing. It describes the transition from, nomadic necessity to settled luxury and order. My point is, these people weren't waiting for the Enlightenment to tell them they were distinct. They knew there was a binding agent holding their societies together. When historians use civilization today, we're simply trying to name that binding agent. It's the marriage of a meaning world, so religion, philosophy, art, with institutions, laws, economy, and the state.
That sounds very noble when you frame it as a search for a binding agent, but I believe you're committing a textbook definition of anachronism. You're taking a 21st century sociological definition and just pasting it over the minds of people who were doing something completely different.
How is it anachronistic to acknowledge that they had self-awareness?
Because their self-awareness was local and specific. The Greeks were talking about Greeks. They weren't building some comparative global map of the 10 great civilizations. That framework, the map we use today, it has a birth certificate, was born in France in the mid-1750s. It is a child of the Enlightenment, and that matters because words have DNA.
And you view that DNA as corrupted?
It's not just corrupted, it's directional. When writers in the 18th century started using the term civilization, it wasn't a neutral category. It was singular. There were no civilizations with an S. There was only civilization. And it was synonymous with progress. It meant reason, science, law, commerce. It was a yardstick used explicitly to measure how far we, meaning the Europeans, had come. and how far behind everyone else was.
I grant you that. The 18th century usage was arrogant. It was self-congratulatory.
It was more than arrogant. It was the intellectual software for empire. In the 19th century, even when historians started pluralizing it, talking about Chinese civilization or Indian civilization, the hierarchy remained. You had the savage, then the barbarian, and finally, at the very top of the evolutionary ladder, the civilized. This justified the white man's burden. If you believe you are the embodiment of civilization, then conquering the uncivilized isn't a crime, it's a favor. You're bringing them up the ladder. So my course thesis is this: you cannot separate the analytical tool from this normative judgment. It assumes a homogeneity and a hierarchy that simply never existed.
I think we need to separate the origin of a tool from its utility today. I mean, gunpowder was invented for fireworks before it was used for war, and now we use it for mining. Things change. Just because the word was born in a colonial cradle doesn't mean we can't repurpose it to understand structure. But you mentioned homogeneity, this idea that civilization implies everyone is the same. Let's dig into that, because that is the most common academic critique.
It is, and it's the critique that shatters the concept. Let's look at the term Islamic civilization. We use it constantly. It's on the spine of 1,000 history books. But if you actually zoom in, the cohesion it vanishes. Compare the Abbasid court in Baghdad in the 9th century to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century.
Well, they're centuries apart, so obviously things changed.
But it's not just time, it's the fabric of life. You have distinct Arab, Persian, Turkish, and Berber cultural practices. You have completely different approaches to art, to kinship, to gender. When you lump a 9th century Baghdad poet and a 16th century Balkan soldier into the same box called Islamic civilization, you're creating a false unity. You're telling the audience that these people lived in the same culture. They didn't. You're hiding the diversity of the past just to fit it into a tidy chapter title.
I would strongly disagree with the idea that the unity is false. I think confusing sameness with coherence. I'm not arguing that Baghdad and Istanbul were identical, or that a peasant in the Balkans ate the same food as a Bedouin in Arabia. I am arguing that they participated in a shared universe of meaning.
A universe is a very big place.
But it had rules. Think about the software running those societies. While local practices differed, there were shared canonical texts. They both revered the Quran, they shared legal structures based on Sharia, and more importantly, they shared an educational architecture, the madrasa system. This is crucial. A scholar could travel from Cordoba in Spain to Delhi in India and find a job, a debate, and a home. He understood the legal code, the etiquette, the theology. He was plugged in to a compatible system.
Compatible, perhaps. But does that make it a single unit?
Yes, because that compatibility creates a distinctive macrostructure. It's the same with the West. Plato is a canonical text, whether you are in London or Berlin. The legal traditions of Rome underpin the Code Napoleon and the U.S. Constitution. These are thick, heavy threads that bind eras and geographies together. If we refuse to see these continuities because we're obsessed with local variations, we lose the ability to see the forest for the trees. We become myopic.
I appreciate the software metaphor. It is clever. But let's test that. Let's look at your West example, specifically ancient Greece. We talk about Greek civilization as if it were some solid concrete block. But the reality? Athens and Sparta were radically different societies, politically, socially, culturally. An Athenian democrat would find Spartan life, well, alien and horrifying.
But they could talk to each other. They shared a pantheon of gods.
And they killed each other. The Hellenistic world after Alexander the Great was completely different from the classical polis. Who decided they were all one big thing called Greek civilization? We did. Historians did, centuries later. It is a retrospective construction. We draw a circle around diverse peoples and force them to hold hands so we can write a simpler story.
But if we don't draw those circles, what are we left with? Just disjointed points in time? On Tuesday, a guy in Athens did this. On Wednesday, a guy in Sparta did that. That's not history, it's a logbook. And this leads me to a major concern: the crisis of narrative. Humans are storytelling creatures. We need an arc. Early 20th century thinkers like Spengler and Toynbee, they understood this visceral need.
Spengler. Now there's a name that summons some ghosts.
He's controversial, yes, but he viewed civilizations as organisms. He argued they're born, they grow, they mature, and eventually they decline or die. He wrote The Decline of the West right after World War I when Europe was in ruins. Now, you might disagree with his pessimism or his biology, but that metaphor provides a narrative arc. It helps us process the rise and fall of powers. If we kill the concept of civilization, how do we explain the grand sweeps of time?
But that organism metaphor is exactly why the concept is dangerous. It's what we call teleological.
Okay, for our listeners who don't spend their days in philosophy seminars, let's unpack that.
Teleology means assuming there's a design, a destiny, or an end goal built into history. When you say a civilization is born and matures, you are implying it has a destiny to fulfill. It treats history like a scripted play. But history has no script. It's chaos and contingency. Spengler and Toynbee, they were writing metaphysics, not history.
So what's the alternative? If we reject the container of civilization, how do we organize the past?
We move to connected history. Instead of imagining these sealed containers called civilizations bumping into each other like billiard balls, we study networks. We look at circulation, translation, and hybridity.
Give us a concrete example of what that looks like on the page.
Okay. Take the work of historians who focus on the Indian Ocean or the Silk Road. They don't look at the Mughal Empire and ask, is this Islamic civilization or Indian civilization? They ask, who shared what with whom? Look at the early modern period. You have silver mined in Mexico, stamped by the Spanish, flowing through Manila, and ending up in the pocket of a merchant in Ming China, who is reading a map drawn by a Jesuit using Persian cartography techniques.
That is a beautiful image of complexity.
It's reality. You have these hybrid cultures emerging in port cities, Goa, Malacca, Venice, that don't fit into Western or Eastern boxes. They're fluid. The reality of the past is liquid, not solid. When you use the civilization model, you build walls where there were actually bridges.
I agree that connections are vital. I'm not arguing for isolationism, but I have a logical problem with the network approach. Can you really have connections without nodes?
What do you mean?
You talk about a bridge. You can't have a bridge if you don't have two banks of the river. Can you study the Silk Road without understanding the distinct cultural centers that it connected? If everything is just fluid circulation, then where does the distinctiveness come from? Why did the Chinese merchant want the silver? Why did the European want the silk? Because they came from distinct systems of value and production, distinct civilizations. You need the container to understand the content of the flow.
The banks of that river are shifting sand, not concrete walls. That's the difference. And frankly, maintaining those walls is dangerous because it plays right into the hands of power politics. And this brings us to the postmodern turn. We can't ignore the impact of thinkers who analyzed power and discourse, specifically regarding the East and West.
I knew we would get to the politics of power eventually.
We have to.
The concept of the West didn't just appear naturally. It was created specifically to define itself against the East. The West is rational. The East is mystical. The West is active. The East is passive. It's a strategic mirror. It's identity formation through opposition.
I accept that identity is often formed by defining what you are not. But it's more than identity. It's policy. Look at how Samuel Huntington used this concept right after the Cold War with his theory of the clash of civilizations. He took a map of the world, divided it into cultural blocks, mostly defined by religion, and predicted they were destined to fight. That wasn't a neutral analysis. It was an ideological map used to justify foreign policy. It says, they're different from us, therefore we will clash. It creates the very conflict it predicts.
I agree that Huntington's model is risky and perhaps too rigid. It essentializes people. But let's look at a different thinker, Max Weber. Weber used civilization not to bomb people, but as an ideal type.
An ideal type is still a simplification.
It is, but it's a measuring stick. Weber looked at how rationality, religion, and economy interacted in different societies. He wasn't saying, The West is morally better. He was trying to solve a puzzle. Why did industrial capitalism emerge in Western Europe and not in China or India, despite their massive wealth? To answer that, he had to compare their civilizational structures. We can use the term analytically as a tool to measure and compare, without using it normatively to judge who is good or bad.
Even if you try to be neutral, the term is tainted by who gets to speak. The civilization model privileges a specific kind of history, elite, male, and text-centered. When we look for civilization, what do we look for? Big stone monuments, written laws, court philosophy.
The things that survive.
The things the powerful leave behind. We silence the margins. We silence the subaltern, the common people, the oral traditions, the daily practices of women. By focusing on civilization, we're choosing to listen to the kings and ignoring the peasants. A peasant in France and a peasant in Egypt probably had more in common with each other in terms of their daily struggle with the soil than they did with their respective emperors. Civilization erases that shared human reality.
That's a valid concern about the breadth of our history. We shouldn't just be counting monuments. But this leads us to a deeper, perhaps more philosophical question. Can we ever really know the past as it actually was?
And that is the core of the crisis. Philosophically, the answer is no. We can't know the past as it was. The past is gone. We don't have the past. We only have traces, shards of pottery, faded ink, ruins.
We agree on that. History is a reconstruction, not a playback.
But here is where we differ. You want to take those shards and glue them together into a vase called civilization. And I'm saying the glue is fake. Using that concept imposes a massive, heavy filter on those traces. It forces them into a story that didn't exist at the time. It creates a fiction. It creates a civilization that walks and talks, even though no individual person back then thought, I am a member of the Hellenistic civilization.
I agree that raw history is impossible. We are always telling a story from the present. But arguing that civilization is a construction doesn't mean it's useless. It's a knowledge regime. It's a way of organizing massive amounts of information so our brains can handle it. Without these categories, we're just drowning in data.
But it organizes the data by distorting it. And that is why I propose we focus on practices. Don't study Islamic civilization as an abstract noun. Study fiqh production, how Islamic law was actually written and applied in a specific court. Study bureaucratic writing, study trade receipts. These are concrete actions. When you study practices, you do less violence to the reality of the past. You stay closer to the ground.
But if you only study the ground, you never see the horizon. That is my fear. If we only look at bureaucratic writing or trade receipts, we miss the spirit of the age, the shared worldview that made those practices meaningful. You call it a distortion. I call it synthesis. We need synthesis to understand the human condition.
And I call that synthesis a comforting illusion. It makes us feel like we understand the past, when really we've just projected ourselves onto it.
Let's consider the listeners trying to make sense of the world today. We live in a globalized, confusing world. If they abandon these terms, if they stop thinking in terms of these large cultural blocks, how do they orient themselves?
They orient themselves with humility. That is the key. Using civilization gives a false sense of certainty. It tells us more about the historian's worldview than the past itself. It's a simplifying tool for a complex world. But honest history requires epistemological humility.
Meaning we accept that we can't know everything?
Meaning we acknowledge the chaos. We acknowledge that the networks of the past were messy, contradictory, and didn't fit into neat boxes. We should teach students to trace connections, to follow the silver and the silk and the ideas, not to memorize lists of great civilizations like items on a menu.
I appreciate the call for humility, and we certainly must be cautious of the words colonial legacy. We cannot use it as a weapon of hierarchy ever again. However, I maintain that we cannot abandon the search for macro structures. If we define civilization carefully, not as a rigid box, but as a system of meaning and institutions, it remains a powerful way to organize the human story. It allows us to compare, to contrast, and to understand the different ways humans have tried to create order out of chaos.
A system of meaning, perhaps.
But let us never forget that it's our system of meaning we are imposing, not theirs. We are the ones drawing the lines on the map.
And that is the tension at the heart of our discipline. The crisis of history lies exactly here, in the impossibility of capturing the raw past versus the absolute necessity of creating a meaningful narrative.
We are left to decide if civilization is a bridge that helps us reach the past or a wall that obscures it.
Thank you for listening to The Debate. We hope this conversation has given you a new perspective on the words we use to build our history.
Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.